and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars we've been running in association with LRN and the International Compliance Association. Thank you very much for joining us. Today's session is a really interesting and important topic, and I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel today. And the subject we're going to be exploring is adapting to a changing world in Japan and mastering ethics and compliance program effectiveness in, well, let's face it, is already a tumultuous year, 2025. So we know that LRN has been doing some amazing work in this space around the world. I think the ICA is very proud to work with LRN around their really industry-leading research and giving a global view, which I think is quite unique about what LRN does with their research, but also, crucially, country-specific, jurisdictional, cultural insights as well, to help all of us engage in ethics and compliance as professionals to make our programs more effective. And we're going to really focus on some of the findings today from the latest 2025 Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report. And it's got some amazing, I think, insights, some quite surprising, actually, trends. And it actually builds, I think, on all the background that LRN have put into this report. And you know, it's just reinforcing that message about the importance of programs based around values are much more effective than those that are just purely rules-based as well. And I think the other thing, and we'll hear from our panel, particularly Ty, who I'll introduce in a moment, about the scope of the report. And I think the data that's been gathered is not just from, I think it's over 1,500 compliance professionals all around the world, Ty. But it's not just compliance professionals. I think we've also now engaged with people in the business, employees as well, the same number, which I think is a really, really important perspective as well. So again, we're going to hopefully today learn what you know the best-in-class programs are actually doing well, what makes the most effective programs, and maybe see where some of the gaps are perhaps growing between the less effective programs as well, and actually talk about how we can address some of the challenges that the report highlights and get some practical insights. We've got some great practitioners actually based in Japan as well. So really looking forward to today's session. So I'll begin by introducing myself before I introduce the panel. My name is Pekka Dare. I am the president of the International Compliance Association. I'm currently based in Singapore, but my role is global, including covering the whole Asia Pacific region, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, etc. Many years I've worked in the compliance industry as head of financial crime at a large UK financial institution and money laundering reporting officer in various senior compliance roles. I've also looked at organised crime and tax evasion as from a legal perspective as well. But my role at the ICA is to represent us around the world as well, so delighted to be joining you today. Perhaps I can ask our panel to just very quickly introduce themselves and say hello. In no particular order, but I've got you on the order on my screen panel. So Ty, I'm going to start with you, Ty, if I may. Ty Francis from LRN, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, Ty.
Thank you, Becca, and it's great to be with you all today, and Shuhei and Olga. I think more importantly, to get perspective of people, actually, on the front lines and working in the industry in Japan. I think it's going to be an interesting perspective of how our data from our report resonates with you. My name is Ty Francis. I'm LRN's Chief Advisory Officer. I've been at LRN for about 5 years. For those of you who don't know LRN, we are kind of the world's largest E&C pure play provider. We help companies align their ethics compliance programs, redefine their codes of conduct, measure their culture, evaluate their programs in a 360 view, and provide training for about 220 courses in multiple languages around the world. And we've got operations in pretty much every continent. I've been here for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was at Ethisphere, where I headed up global programs. And then prior to that, I spent about 4.5 years at the New York Stock Exchange, where I was vice president of the NYSE Governance Services Division. And my team and our marketing team have been writing and authoring this report for about 11 years, and this is our 11th edition of this. And I'll go into a bit more about what the report says and what it does in a bit.
Fantastic, thank you, Ty. Thanks again for joining us. Shuhei, thank you again for joining us. Nice to see you again. We met in Japan on my last trip. So Shuhei Fujimura from Oxford University Press, welcome. And perhaps if you could introduce yourself to our audience, Shuhei.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shuhei Fujimura. I'm Senior Ethics and Compliance Manager at Oxford University Press. OUP is a department of the University of Oxford. It is our mission to further Oxford University's objective of excellence in research, scholarship, and education by publishing worldwide. OUP has been around for 500 years, and we are the world's largest university publisher. I cover the compliance issues covering Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia and joint ventures global operations. I am very honored to be part of this panel discussion with such an excellent peers expert. Each brings a rich and diverse set of experiences and backgrounds. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shuhei, and great to have you. Looking forward to hearing your valuable insights as well. And last but not least, Olga Belosludova, welcome from Paul Hastings. And Olga, it was really interesting hearing your background as well. I think you've got an amazing, I guess, background to share with the audience. It's a great insight as well. So perhaps you could introduce yourself and say hello, and maybe about your own role and your background, Paul Hastings, and the work that you do as well.
Of course, thank you so much for the great introduction. It is my pleasure to join this webinar today. My name is Olga Belosludova, and I'm an associate working at Paul Hastings, a law firm based in the US. They do have an office here in Tokyo, so today I'm joining from Tokyo office. I actually am admitted to practice law in Japan, California, and New York, and I have lived in Japan since the age of 2. I don't look that way, but I'm a Japanese native speaker. I work here in Japan, and I guess I'm fully integrated in the Japanese culture. The half of the work that I do is giving advice to foreign companies doing business in Japan. So half of the work is giving advice on Japan practice. And the other half that I do is conducting investigations. And many of them are global investigations that involve Japanese subsidiaries or Japanese companies. Some of them are like daily compliance issues. Some of them are really high-stake investigations. So I do a lot of investigations, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Fantastic. So again, I think you'll agree, everyone, it's a great panel with a mixture of global and local insight from Japan as well. So fantastic. Thank you, everyone. So look, let's kick off. And Ty, I'm going to pass the baton to you. I know you've got a few snapshots of the key findings for those people who haven't had the chance to digest everything in the report yet. I know we're going to make the links available, and it really is interesting reading. So Ty, over to you. If you perhaps let's start us off with an overview, then we can pull that apart, panel. Ty.
Thank you, Pekka. So yeah, the report we're going to talk about today is our 2025 Ethics Compliance Program Effectiveness Report. We've been running the report for just over a decade. This will be our 11th issue of the report. The report has gone through some changes over the last 10 years. Initially, the report was a kind of just overview of the market, trends, best practices, looking at how companies perform with their ethics compliance programs. We changed it slightly in 2021 to become more of a benchmark report, so we can look back and compare year on year and look at trends, hopefully looking at those trends to kind of look at forward-facing issues that compliance officers may face. And again, we've normally stuck to about 1,500 compliance professionals worldwide. This year was different. The 2025 report actually not only had 1,500 survey respondents as compliance professionals, but also employees of organizations as well. So new for this year, it was a kind of direct juxtaposition of employee experience and compliance professional perspectives. So we really got a deeper understanding of the alignment or gaps of how programs are operating. There was a North American report to begin with, so about 40% of our respondents came from North America, USA and Canada, but 10% of the respondents were from Japan, another 10% from ANZAC, and 10% from Singapore, with the remainder coming from Europe, mostly from the UK, France, and Germany. You will hear me talk about high, medium, and low impact programs in this discussion. And the way we do this, when we look at compliance programs, is how they function, how they operate, and how culture impact is measured by reviewing three main things. Those three things are, ethical decision making, and that's really, are the choices that employees are making animated by values or expediency? Are they checking the box, or are they leading with their values? We also look at organizational justice. So are senior executives in organizations, and high performers for that matter, held to the same standards of conduct as other employees? And then finally, we look at freedom of expression. Do employees speak up? Do they contribute willingly and exchange ideas freely? Are they free from pressure, retaliation, or reprisal? So based on that kind of methodology we've been using over the last 10 years, we then allocate those programs as high impact, medium impact, and low impact. So what I'll do, I'll just share my screen very quickly so we can look at some of the key findings of, first of all, the global report. So that's everything included. And then we'll break out some of the key findings from the Japanese survey. And again, what I'm really interested in finding out is both Olga and Shuhei's kind of lived experiences of whether they see that data as happening to them, and some of the kind of interventions that they recommend that companies put into place to try and change some of those perceptions. So let me just do this very quickly. Hopefully everyone can see this.
Yes, that's great, Tommy.
Technology has not let me down. Amazing. And this is from a Gen Xer. Right, so if I talk about some of the key findings of the report to start with, we found that benchmarking was a big factor in a lot of the research we did. And we found that the benchmarking gap has increased again between high and medium impact programs. We found that high impact programs were 1.9 times more likely to use benchmarking data, leveraging that kind of those data and analytical tools, including data animation, so automation, and to manage their compliance programs. They were also 1.3 times more likely to report that benchmarking data to their boards of directors. So again, the trend has always been that high impact programs are using data in a more proactive and measure rather than reactive. We find that medium impact programs, when they don't use data analytics, when they use kind of siloed information very reactively, it's difficult for them to predict trends. It's very difficult for them to allocate resources effectively because they don't know where their issues are lying from a day-to-day basis. And it makes them very prone to kind of knee-jerk reaction to compliance issues. And also they kind of get to that information very late. What was interesting is that gap is increasing, and I'll show you the data from the Japanese report in just a second. The second thing we looked at was the perception gap between middle management and senior leadership. We found there was nearly a double of a gap between the positive perceptions of middle management making difficult decisions consistent with their company values versus that of senior executives. With when we asked senior executives, 79% of them said they used company values within their everyday decision making versus middle management at 37%. So that's a 42% gap there. And as for context, it's the largest gap we've seen in the last 5 years, even since the pandemic. What we saw during the pandemic was what we call the pandemic paradox, where leaders were kind of applauding their companies on how they weathered the storm and weathered the pandemic. They were praising their frontline workers and how they were the backbone of the organizations. However, what they were missing was the fact that this messaging wasn't getting cascaded down. And so when you asked middle managers and junior managers and frontline workers why that messaging was missing, frontline workers were kind of disagreeing with that and saying that the leadership didn't know what they were, what was happening with the companies. And there was a very kind of ivory tower, rose glass kind of view on how companies were operating. The other thing we looked at was misconduct trend analysis, and I'll be interested for Olga's kind of perspectives on this, doing so many investigations. We found that high impact programs were more likely to use misconduct trend analysis in their compliance programs, in root cause analysis. at a rate of about 63%, compared to 33% that of medium impact programs. So that medium high impact multiplier was about double. We also looked at emerging generational divides. This is a kind of a very kind of fired conversation about generations, and we looked at the boomer generation, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, and we found that Gen Z were twice as likely to report skepticism regarding managerial fairness. Again, this was just building on some of that Gen Z data we found from our code of conduct report and our ethical benchmarking report, where we found that to a certain extent, when we asked questions like, have you violated a rule in your code of conduct, the Gen Z populations that we surveyed were twice as likely to say that they've broken a rule versus Generation X or the boomer generation. And then last but not least, and again, Shuhei and Olga will have some great perspectives on this, the increased focus on emerging risks. So that's supply chain, third-party due diligence, and the adoption of AI tools in their benchmarking and data analytics and in their compliance programs. And we found that high impact programs were 2.3 times more likely to use this, advanced analytical tools in third-party due diligence supply chain than medium impact programs. And this is despite especially some of the regulation coming out of Europe, like CSDDD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Act, but also the news coming out of DOJ in September last year, where they asked companies to be more focused on supply chain due diligence, periodically reviewing their supply chains rather than a kind of one and done snapshot. So that was interesting. So what we'll do then is we'll look at some of the key findings from the Japanese report. Now, what we found was the benchmarking gap was substantially greater between high and medium impact programs at a level of 2.6%, which meant that those high impact programs in Japan were even more likely to use benchmarking data and data analytics tools and report that data to boards. And you'll see the trend that kind of those small group of high impact programs that are using ethical decision making, organizational justice, and freedom of expression were really outpacing medium impact programs. And so the gap is getting further. So these medium impact programs are getting left behind. We also found that the perception gap, this was a little bit different. So this is why I'm going to be super interested to hear Shuhei and Olga's perspectives. The gap is slightly lower between middle management executives in Japan at 1.9 times, where they don't think there's a bigger enough gap between middle management and senior management and how they're using ethical decision making. Then we looked at misconduct trend analysis. Again, we found it greater in Japan for high impact programs. We found that 69% versus 63% of high impact programs globally. So they're bucking the trend there slightly. High impact programs in Japan are using misconduct data more readily in their root cause analysis and their compliance program evaluations. And medium impact programs are very, very low there, 27%. So that, again, that high medium multiplier is heightened in Japan at about 2.6 times, again, which is quite a large result. The generational divide, this was a tricky one to kind of contemplate because obviously the data, we didn't feel there was enough data to do a real deep dive into it. However, what we did see is that managerial fairness rates lower than global companies in Japan at 35% versus 55% globally. And last but not least, emerging risks. So again, like the data is consistently showing us with high impact programs, medium impact programs are lagging behind at a significant rate. So 3.2 times in adoption rate. So we looked at the benchmarking gap, which was, in globally was 1.9 times between high and medium impact programs. And benchmarking gap was 2.6 times in Japan. Again, in emerging risks, 3.2 times. So we are seeing that high impact programs are adopting these kind of data analytics tools, these dashboards at a far greater rate than medium impact programs. Obviously, we'll deep dive into all these numbers. The report was pretty large. It is the largest report of its kind in the industry right now. And again, having that juxtaposition of employer perception, this is the compliance professionals who are administering the programs, versus the employees who are actually getting that data, who are seeing this in their organizations. They are looking at the behavior and the culture within your organizations. It was super important because we could really see and help compliance professionals plug those gaps.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ty. Great summary. And I think there's an awful lot to unpack there. And I'll be fascinated, as I say, to hear the perspective. So should we start with you, Shuhei? I know we had a bit of a conversation around the planning around this webinar. So for you, what are the interesting themes that you take away from that report? And maybe what perspectives can you shed on that from I guess, also a Japanese perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's several points, and I think this report is really fantastic. And there's several points I wanted to highlight. I think misconduct trend analysis use is very important. And I think many Japanese companies still think that having a well-crafted compliance policy and program created by external professional will be a solution for establishing the most effective ethics and compliance program, but it is a misconception. There's no perfect compliance system, and we must commit continuous improvement of compliance, corporate compliance program. This is why the UK Bribery Act mandates the entities to perform monitoring and review activities as one of its 6 guiding principles. So therefore, we must continuously seek the better ways of measuring, and it's through the combination of the KPIs, key performance indicators. So our compliance team, what I can share is our compliance team periodically reviews and each component of offices and business separate from our regular audit performed by internal audit department. And this is a collaborative approach with the business to spot potential weakness on the control. This activity ensures the risks are adequately identified and addressed, and that our compliance program is implemented consistently and appropriately across all the division, country, and entities. This review helps proactively identify areas where OUP is potentially vulnerable to bribery and fraud and other unethical conduct, and that improves to our resilience. So we use data from our hotline, from Speak Up, to target areas to review. So as highlighted in the LRN's report, it is important to use such a data to identify areas for improvement within our compliance framework. And this monitoring and review process is crucial for global organizations to identify gaps between the business regions and countries. So this is just an example of the various methods we use to measure effectiveness of our compliance program. But I fundamentally agree that fundamental elements of the compliance best practice is to establish an ethical culture that permeates organization that can be help make all the business professional willing participants in eliminating unnecessary risk and circuiting the ethical lapse before they occur.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that you made some really important points, the importance of using the data analytics to actually see where the heat map is within your organization, where the trend analysis is taking you. And from my perspective, on my travels around the Asia Pacific region, that's a very common expectation now from both regulators and compliance teams. When you're doing effectively your risk analysis, your risk assessment, whether that's for compliance misconduct, whether it's for anti-bribery, fraud, whatever it may be, you are using actual credible data from internal data analytics as well as the external threat map, as it were, and that you can demonstrate to a regulator, to a stakeholder, that a third party, for example, that risk assessment is robust and based on credible data. I think that is very important and timely, as Ty was alluding to as well. Shuhei, we'll come back to you, I'm sure. I just want to make sure we get Olga's thoughts initial thoughts on the report. I know there are a few areas, Olga, that you see in your practice that kind of echo very strongly with the points in the report. So based on what Shuhei's just said and your own thoughts on the report, can perhaps give us your thoughts?
Yes, first of all, I really liked what Shuhei mentioned, that there is no perfect compliance system. It always has to be constantly reviewed and improved, not like every year, but like maybe every quarter sometimes. And I guess I think reading the report, the important part is like looking at the data and actually analyzing it. And I sometimes see companies where they create a lot of like list of elements on data, what they want to like actually collect. And at the end of the day, they end up like not updating that data much, maybe once a year, but like actually like updating that data more daily will assist the companies to understand what their trends are even during the year. So I really want to like emphasize that point, that the data is really important and you really need to update that data day to day to actually analyze it perfectly.
Yes, and I think that's right, that point that regulators are now pushing to say, show us how you make sure that data is current and how you're identifying trends as they happen. And I know, Ty, in the past, you've spoken on events about leading and lagging indicators of concern within an organisation. But there's another area, Olga, I wanted to talk to you about, and then perhaps come back to Ty and Shuhei about, which is the aspects around third-party due diligence, supply chain due diligence. I think that's a really interesting insight as well, that again, maybe that gap between the effective programs and the medium and even the low is perhaps broadening in some cases. What's your take on the importance of third-party due diligence, and where are you seeing good practices, and maybe where are you seeing less, let's call them less good practices? Where are you seeing some of those?
Okay, so I guess the report actually highlights that the third-party due diligence is an emerging risk. Obviously, yes, that is. And it is really interesting to see that obviously like law firms get engaged with clients, especially when something goes wrong. And we obviously deal with a lot of regulators. And we see a trend that sometimes regulators actually ask what kind of third-party due diligence you were doing, whether it was like a one-time off thing, what kind of questions you ask the third parties, how much resource you put in, and what kind of contract you have. Can you give us a copy? So they really dig into it. It's not that they ask like, did you do third-party due diligence? And that's it. They really actually ask detailed questions when they think it is necessary. And obviously, as a company, you really need to have everything prepared beforehand. You don't want to say to them that we don't have any third-party due diligence program in place. Of course, that's the first thing you don't want to say. And second, you don't want to say that like you don't put much resource there, you have other emphasis. So it's really important for companies to understand that this is an emerging risk and actually put the resource there. And Pekka, maybe you can chime in with more thoughts.
Yeah, sure. And I couldn't agree more. And I certainly see effectively what you need is to be able to demonstrate the process. It's an audit trail, effectively. How do you, what is the narrative around how did you make the decision to engage with this third party, and how did you justify that decision? You know, I've seen many organizations, they'll do a fairly standard questionnaire to third parties, and it almost becomes a box ticking exercise. So I guess my regulators are now actually going beyond that process, and they're saying, okay, you may have a paper-based program, but when you do your third-party due diligence, who actually scrutinises these questionnaires? You know, for example, what open source media do you look at? What adverse news do you check? And to your point that you made, how frequently do you review? Because things change. You know, you might enter into a third-party relationship, supply chain relationship, and there's a significant development, a change in geopolitical risk, a change in there's adverse development in terms of negative news about your counterparty. How do you identify that risk, those emerging risks? So I think it's about thinking how you move beyond just paper-based to demonstrate that there is a meaningful process. And the final thing I would say, perhaps before we get Shuhei and Ty's thoughts on third-party due diligence, is demonstrating whether in reality this actually results in real business decisions and consequences. So for example, have you ever walked away from a potential third-party relationship due to concerns about ethical or compliance issues? Have you ever put additional restrictions, whether it's contractually or monitoring or whatever it might be, ring fencing certain activity, but based on ethical or compliance decisions, and what is the role in senior management in making those decisions, and indeed in the business making those decisions. Because if you have a compliance program on paper, but you have never ever done any of these things to change a business decision, it will tell a regulator, actually, this is more of a paper-based program rather than one in reality. So I'll come back to you, Tai. I don't know what your thoughts are on what Shuhei and Olga have said there, and maybe you want to start with the third-party due diligence piece.
So look, I mean, I don't have to reinforce the importance of conducting third-party due diligence, but what we did see, which was again alarming, was the kind of adoption rates. So we asked questions like, how much effort does your program expend on the following areas? And one of the questions was due diligence before engaging third parties. So for Olga and Shuhei, this is a table stakes. This is 100%. Everyone does due diligence before engaging third parties. But what we found was, and this is the professional survey, so this isn't the perception of an employee, this is a perception of a compliance officer around the globe saying, what percentage of your effort goes into due diligence. High impact programs rated 51%. So what we're saying is half of all high impact programs are really putting a lot of effort into due diligence, engaging third parties. Now, if you go to medium impact programs, that drops to 22%. And then low impact programs who, as you said, Pekka, are ticking the box, it was 15%. So again, that's a huge gap.
That's really worrying. I think that's a worrying finding, isn't it?
It is. And look, this report isn't meant to be, we'd love it to be roses. We'd love it to be everyone's doing the right thing and trying to make the industry better. But we are seeing alarming gaps in between what high impact programs are doing and programs that are just ticking the box. And these are the programs and the companies who are really leaving themselves open for huge reputational risk and fines and and destroying their reputations globally.
I mean, Shuhei's already mentioned the Bribery Act. Obviously, we have many other extraterritorial regimes, local requirements in your jurisdictions you operate. I mean, one thing I would say before we go back to Shuhei and Tai, you may wish to expand, is the importance of having a credible risk assessment methodology as well when you're onboarding a third party. So regulators will want to see how are you making these decisions and putting your counterparties in a risk-based category. What is that methodology for assessing the risk that this third party poses? And then as a result, how credible is the due diligence that flows out of that risk-based approach? And as a human being, actually, despite the importance of technology here, that human beings are making critical thinking decisions backed up by data about the level of risk that counterparty poses. Let's talk about one of the really interesting findings again, I think, which is the disconnect that we see again with middle managers. And this is a theme that's come out of the LRN reports over the years, but it seems to almost be growing in some jurisdictions anyway. So maybe Japan, perhaps not quite as much based on the survey results. Tai, perhaps can I get your thoughts on that generational challenge and what the data tells us, and maybe what we can do to address that? And I'd be interested to hear from Shuhei and Olga about their thoughts on that as well.
So I think that two big questions there. I think it'd be interesting to take the kind of management leadership gap first, and then I'm sure we can have a bigger discussion about the generational divide and how we kind of fix it, how we help it, how we kind of control that kind of it's spreading out of control. Is that we were asking questions like, what steps have your organizational leaders taken to respond to compliance risks and challenges? So that was the kind of question bucket. And the question we asked then was, have you made a difficult decision consistent with your company's values and purpose? So, let's go back to 2021 when we were just coming out of the COVID pandemic. 85% of senior leaders were saying that they'd made a difficult decision consistent with their company values. And middle management were coming in at about 62%. So it was a 23-point gap. Again, it was okay. We thought that was bad. And then as we've gone through 22, 23, 24, now 25, only 79% of leaders have said they've used their company values in decision-making, whereas 37% of middle management. We call this report caught in the middle for a reason. We do feel that this messaging is getting caught in within middle management. You know, we've heard, and you and I have talked about this before, Beck, about tone from the top. And I really do think this is the time to start talking about tone from the middle. And you know, there are simple interventions. I'm sure my panelists will help kind of articulate this as well. But you know, it's information, communication, and training. It's understanding that middle managers have got a different role than your average employee. They've got managerial aspects to what they're doing. They're training multiple people. So the kind of education, the training you're giving to an employee is for them. And we're not trying to teach people to be compliance officers. We're trying to help people do their jobs more effectively. One of our panelists from one of our sessions in London, Rebecca Mayfield, called compliance officers bodyguards. So we really are helping protect you and to do your job. Now, when a manager's concerned, a manager's got a multifaceted kind of role, not just in understanding the compliance risks themselves, but for their teams and how that kind of intersects with the organization as well. So that training should be different. It should have different complexities in it than a manager would take. And I think that what a lot of companies are falling down on is not changing or adapting their training enough, because then middle managers don't really understand in not just how to do their jobs, but how to cascade that messaging and make sure that messaging from the top that leadership are being very carefully curating is kind of cascading down through and kind of missing those filters.
Yeah, and certainly my perspective on that is that we're now seeing regulators really, again, looking at that training quality to make sure that it includes, you know, it's practically role-based, role-specific training wherever possible, and also level-specific. I think it's very helpful. And I know it's labor-intensive and costly, but part of what we're doing here is also the positive messaging about the benefits of ethical and compliant behaviour, that we get into this message around sustainable, profitable business is ethical business. And actually, that's a very positive message for middle managers to have. Shuhei, what are your thoughts on that kind of middle management disconnect that we're still perhaps seeing, and maybe some ideas about how to address it?
So the disconnection between senior leaders and the frontline line employees is really concerning. I completely agree with the LRM's report assertion that employees' skepticism about organizational justice undermines the foundation of the ethical cultures. The only remedy for this is close communication within the organizations. As we know, Principle 5 of the UK Bribery Act requires entity to ensure the policies and procedures are embedded and understood throughout the organization through internal and external communication, including training. That is proportionate to the risk they face. So providing more customized and tailored training content to address relevant compliance risk is crucial. So delivering meaningful and effective training is a key. I particularly recommend a case study style training where participants discuss the risk and how to mitigate them. So we usually create a case study from the past incidents or investigation case, anonymizing them to maintaining confidentialities. And using a real case actually helps attract participants' attention and actively engage them in the training. So this approach ensures the training is not only informative, but also compelling and relevant to their daily work. We also share case study to demonstrate how being ethical organization with a robust compliance program gives us a competitive advantage in business. So let me share one example. OUP received the invitation from the Ministry of Education overseas regarding a textbook procurement tender for refreshing a certain subject. And this tender represented a substantial business opportunities for publishers. In this tender, we received the feedback stating OUP's clear policies and high expectation for its employee around ethics and compliance are assets that will help reassure the government buyers and reduce the potential risk for received or otherwise. So being able to talk about our commitment to doing the business ethically and having a strong demonstrable past performance will help us exceed expectation in the tender bid. So in conclusion, I believe bridging the gap between leadership actions and employees' expectations through the effective communication and training not only strengthens our ethical culture, but also position us as a trusted and competitive organization in the market.
Fantastic. A great example you gave there, Shuhei. Thank you for that. And I've seen many examples in my own career where compliance actually has a role during the procurement process, the tender, and can really actually make the difference. And I saw Ty nodding when you were mentioning, scenario-based trading. That's certainly the way ICA has gone now with its in-house client training offerings. Making meaningful scenario-based training based on actual artifacts and terminology that they see in their real work is so much more impactful than just kind of theoretical, training around the law or regulations. Olga, let's come to you and your thoughts on that middle management kind of perhaps potential disconnect and maybe how we address it. What's your take on that?
Yes, the report also highlighted that the transparency is a key to address the gap. And usually, it is difficult for employees to approach leadership members. And especially that differs from culture by culture. And in Asia, Japan, where I work, employees are more hesitant than any other countries to approach their leadership members. So the best way is obviously from the leadership members to approach the employees. And it's not just like setting up meetings. It's, I guess, understanding the Japanese employees first. And a lot of times I see a disconnect when the senior leadership is a foreigner that doesn't speak Japanese and they try to transmit the message in English, even though the audience is Japanese. I was actually shocked that a lot of Americans think that Japanese speak perfect English and they're more confident communicating in English, which is not actually the case. They can read and write, but a lot of times they're really hesitant to express themselves in English. So obviously when the message comes in English and they're asked to speak up in English, the language that they're not really used to speak, obviously they will just remain silent, and the opportunity that leadership creates for that transparency will just go south, and it won't be as effective as it will be if it will be delivered in Japanese. And obviously using a translator is a good idea, but obviously you have to find a good translator or else the message will be lost in translation. The person that translates actually needs to understand the background where that message is coming from, not just superficially trying to translate it. So I think that's also the key.
Yeah, how interesting, and making sure that you're making it easy for people to speak up and be very aware of potential cultural barriers. Not just in Japan, but if you're operating across a range of jurisdictions. And I certainly work with a lot of firms who have really consciously invested in addressing that in their compliance and speak up messaging. Certainly here in Asia, we see it a lot. I'm doing some work Friday in Cambodia. Just a different culture, totally different again. To here in Singapore. So very interesting. What about the Gen Z thing? I think that's a fascinating conversation. We could probably devote a whole webinar to that easily, couldn't we? In fact, I know we could. The generational challenges. We'll talk a little bit about perhaps some cultural challenges here. Listen, I'm getting on in my dotage, but it's fascinating. I have, I know Ty, you're the same. You've got kids now. My kids are sort of Gen Z. But what's your thoughts, Ty, on what it tells us about the LRN report tells us about the generational disconnects, maybe, or difference attitudes, and how can we, perhaps more importantly, how can we address that when we're trying to drive effectiveness of ethics and compliance?
So I think it's important to look at context about how we are looking at this kind of comparative analysis. And Olga kind of talked about how to kind of approach Gen Z and how to kind of bridge that gap. There's also data to suggest that older generations, baby boomers and Gen X, exhibit kind of higher trust in managers just because of tenure. They've been there longer. They've got more experience in using and working in these kind of structures and organizations, and they've got a lot of familiarity. So they kind of have an embedded trust, whereas millennials less so. And if you look at Gen Z, they have comparatively lower trust levels, and they highlight this massive critical area for improvement that Olga recommended. When we're talking about Gen Z themselves, we had some great data from our ethical benchmarking report last year, and again, this really reinforces why companies need to pay attention to the data they have. Understanding the kind of the genetic makeup of their organizations is crucial. Conducting real compliance and ethics culture surveys in their organizations is critical. I applaud companies who do engagement surveys and HR surveys, but those surveys are really designed to understand how you, an employer, should react with an employee. Are you paid well enough? Do you have enough holiday time? Do you like working from home? But remember, those surveys are a two-way street. So I, as an HR officer, want to understand what you want and give me feedback. So there's no anonymity there. So most employees, when they fill out surveys, kind of answer surveys the way they think they should fill out surveys. When you have a true ethical culture assessment, which has anonymity, those employees tend to answer those more truthfully. So you really get the understanding of the organizational justice there, the pressure, the
psychological safety. Yeah,
exactly. Psychological. You and I are attuned, but because you're not going to understand that enough, and until you get that data from your company, you can't create any interventions to try and help it. So when we looked at this data, and I'll share a couple of slides which will kind of highlight why this is so important, is because you have misconduct everywhere. And when you have misconduct, you have a kind of an area of what do we do with this misconduct data? So just making sure everyone can see what I'm seeing.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So a director, a friend of mine who was part of a big focus group that we did a couple of years ago, where we had 40 directors of public company boards across the world and asked them their perceptions of ethical culture. He said a very interesting thing. He said, there's no town in the world with 100,000 people living there with no one in jail. So I think we need to understand that there's misconduct everywhere, no matter how ethical we think our companies are. And so if you look at the first bar chart, we asked people across all kind of cultures, have you observed employee misconduct or unethical behavior? And 31, 30, 38. So around a third of people had seen misconduct, which is fine. If you walk down the street, you'll see trash, you'll see crimes. It happens everywhere. Now, the difference is where is that misconduct being reported and who's it being reported by? So if you see on the right-hand graph, you'll see that 93% of those people who are in strong ethical cultures with high impact programs, 93% are reporting this misconduct versus 84% with moderate, again, great, but then 63 for weak cultures. So 63% of people. So you're talking over a third of employees are not reporting misconduct. That's a huge risk for a company. And understanding this, where this data is, can be life or death for some companies.
Well, look, some of the biggest misconduct fraud cases, I've seen internally, it's the colleagues. They know their colleagues are engaged in unethical or misconduct, and you've got to make it easy for them, Ty.
So let's kind of dig down into what that Gen Z conundrum really is. So again, just for context, when we're talking about Gen Z, we're not talking about my 12-year-and-a-half-year-old daughter, who is technically Gen Z. We're talking about employees between the age of 18 and 27, millennials 28 to 43, Gen X is 44 to 59, and then boomers are 60 years or older at the time of answering the survey. So here's some of the alarming data with Gen Z. Okay, we asked the question, is it okay to break the rules if needed to get the job done? Nearly 30% of Gen Z said yes, whereas boomers were 12%. So that's 2.5 times less likely to break the rules. Okay. Now, this is a question which was a more of a direct, tangible kind of question. In the past year, have you engaged in behavior that violates your company's code of conduct or standards? Gen Z, 22% of Gen Z said they have done this, versus Gen X or boomers, which is 10%. So again, Gen Z were 2.2 times more likely to say that they violated something in their code of conduct. Now, again, if you look about how many people reported misconduct in the last slide I shared, you've got a third of people aren't reporting in low impact programs, and 22% of those are actively saying, I have violated something in my code of conduct. So,
yeah, wow, that raises some interesting questions.
And we have a theory of why this is happening, and I'll very quickly talk about it's a study that an American-Israeli behavioral scientist called Dan Ariely kind of used, and it's a dice analogy. So your normal red six-sided dice, and he had 20 people in a room, and he asked each person to throw the dice and to guess which side it landed on. And the reason he did that, he said, well, whatever side it lands on, if you guess correctly, I'll give you $1 for every number on that dice. So, for example, if they threw a 6 and they guessed top, they would get $6. If they guessed bottom, they get 1. 5 and 2, 3 and 4, vice versa. But the trick was, he said, don't tell me until the dice actually rolls. Okay, so he was putting a lot of trust in these people. So he did the first experiment, the first round, and everyone was very, 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 very lucky. Everyone seemed to be getting the highest numbers. So if they rolled a 1, oh, I guessed bottom, so that's $6 for me, please. And if they rolled a 6 and they said, oh, top, that's $6 for me, please. So he then attached a lie detector to all of these participants in the second round. So what do you think happened? Well, it proved that people were cheating. But they weren't cheating as much, because obviously they had a lie detector and there was a consequence. There was a kind of perception of reputation that they cheated. But again, they were still very, very lucky. So he did a third test. And what he said was, still with the lie detector attached, every one you get right, that money goes to a charity of your choice. So he did the test. So what do you think happened? Well, firstly, the lie detector stopped working, because lie detectors don't detect lies, they detect tension and anxiety. And these people didn't feel tension or anxiety anymore, because the result of their fraud or their dishonesty was for a good cause. And it's an excuse that Elizabeth Holmes used, and a lot of other entrepreneurs who had kind of fallen foul of regulatory issues have said that, well, we did this because we felt it was the right thing to do, regardless of what the rules and regulations said. So going back to what Olga was talking about, and Shuhei with his conversation about case studies, we have to reevaluate how we are educating and training this group in this demographic, because they are not learning the same way we learned when we were going through this training. They need case studies. They need to figure out how they are involved with the organization around them, how their values align with the company's values. So it all comes down to education and communication. Are leaders communicating the messaging which is resonating with that group of individuals? And as you see from the data, this is a big risk for companies. And companies who are relying on engagement surveys or once a year kind of spot checks are missing that kind of trend analysis, that longitudinal data that you only get from periodic benchmarking and data and analytics. So that's incredibly important.
Interesting. Shuhei, what's your thoughts from a perspective in Japan, perhaps, on that generational divide that Ty's so eloquently outlined?
So I think it's a very interesting point, and Gen Z trend is especially interesting. And the fostering, generally speaking, like fostering ethical culture with these groups, as well as, I observe Southeast and Northeast Asia, where the culture is different. It requires multi-faced approach, and there's no absolute one answer for this, and it's quite difficult. With more than 5,000 employees, presence around 50 countries, and thousands of business partners, OUP is a truly global organization. So at the end of the day, we cannot achieve healthy ethical organization just by implementing certain methodology or our latest technology. So I think having a clear mission is a first step to building an ethical organization. Once we have the mission or philosophy that defines why this organization needs to exist in society, people share the same value under the same mission and will naturally do everything they can do to defend its reputation, fostering a commitment to the highest standard of integrity. So at OUP, we believe that our great resources is our people. So the best way to ensure compliance is to help our people cultivate a company culture where everyone is empowered to eliminate unnecessary risk and support compliance. So therefore, we should focus on establishing a clear mission and ethical culture that permeates the organization. So our chief executive, Nigel Portwood, emphasized the importance of a strong ethical culture in our code of conduct. He highlights acting the integrity is crucial for our success and protect our world-class reputation that spans over 500 years. So the commitment to the ethics and supported by our executive committee gives us a competitive advantage and ensure our resilience. So this ethical culture contributed by everyone in the organization is a key to our long-term survival and success. So finally, we have to also work closely and collaboratively with relevant business functions and coordinate well with these stakeholders to write judgment. I often keep in mind that people in our business sometimes see us as inflexible as Inspector Javert in the Les Miserables, but people may feel like scared to reach out to us, or people may feel they do not want to bother contacting us. But thankfully, it's not true. Compliance is actually very simple. We seek flexible solution by mitigating risks. So our department works for more precisely defined criteria of what is right and what is wrong. So our team works together to promote good decision and good judgment. Therefore, we always try to give a message to our business that we are here to support and reinforce everyone's responsibility to maintain and strengthen our ethical culture. So in conclusion, fostering ethical culture globally is a continuous and ongoing effort that requires a clear mission, empowered employees, and collaborative work, not only from the compliance professional, but also everyone in the business. By committing to these principles, organization can build a resilient and ethical culture that stands strong in a complex modern society. That's what I think of.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Shuhei. And that draws very much back to the point around making sure that, we began the whole session with the importance of contextualizing, ethical business and the importance of moving away from rules-based and giving people that reason to buy into the ethical standards of an organization and a consistency of that message. Olga, your thoughts on the conversation we've just had from Ty and Shuhei about maybe perhaps Gen Z, and maybe, let's not forget, we do have a range of these, we're not just focusing our messages on Gen Z, but obviously as time goes on, that percentage of the workforce is going to change. So what are your thoughts on that discussion, Olga?
I guess especially with the gaps with the Gen Z. The Gen Zs, I guess, grew up in a different environment. The internet was always there. They had their iPhone. They could always get the information that they want proactively rather than hearing it from someone else. So I think they have a lot of information, and they're making their decision maybe based on other sources than what the company is valuing or what the company is trying to message to those employees. So again, I think it is really really important for the company to try to transmit the message that they want to those Gen Z employees, and especially the way that they learn is quite different from those other generations. They may use like internet, like e-learning more efficiently than the others. Maybe a short video would be more efficient than like a 2-hour seminar. So I guess tailoring for them based on how they grew up, I think is a really important aspect that the company needs to take in when even training them.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And it's not perhaps one size fits all. And I think just being more thoughtful in that approach, I think is very important. Okay, well, look, let's start to think about wrapping up the session. And what I'd like to do is go to each of you for some sort of closing thoughts on, for you, what are the key takeaways of the report? And maybe just a bit of practical advice you'd like to give to the audience. What practical takeaways would you give? And I'm going to try and be ruthless and give you maybe 90 seconds each. Whether I some sort of horn or buzzer, I can cut you off dead. I don't know. I'll be that ruthless. So if you can aim for about 90 seconds, panel, is that okay? And then we can wrap up. It's been a great, never enough time in these conversations. And look, again, if you haven't had a chance to go through the report for the audience, please, it's got some great insights as well. So I'm going to give Ty the final word, if that's okay, on this. And Shuhei, I'll come to you first. If you can summarize for you, what do you take as the key takeaways, and maybe one piece of kind of practical advice to our audience from the report, what it tells us?
Yeah, I think the report basically highlights the importance of fostering the ethical cultures, while there's a lot of interesting factors like Gen Z gap or gap between the frontliners and leaders. But again, as I kind of mentioned in the previous talk, I think the important thing is to fostering the same value cultures, and also particularly I think for Japanese companies, maybe the areas of the third party risk assessment could be also the weak spot. I think this is also area has been weak because until recently under the Japanese labor law, Japanese unfair competition prevention law act to punish non-compliance individual committing the bribery abroad on behalf of a Japanese entity was not existent, but it was actually enhanced in I think April 2024. So I think it's important in the due diligence to avoid simple ticking box exercise, as everyone mentioned. At OUP, our team and I pay extra attention to these responses from third parties in the due diligence program, and we are always ready to ask further clarification and follow-up, responses. So I think the important thing is that everyone do not we can create ethical cultures easily. We have to pay attention and endeavors endlessly to seek better programs. And I think for me, it's really assuring to hear our compliance program, which focus these kind of areas, is actually recognized as a high impact program under your report and criteria. So this acknowledgement really confirm us. And I think other institutions who had concern maybe need to go through these reports and just follow. I think I got really strong assurance from your reports. So I think this really helps. These kind of report really helps to shape your organization's compliance program better in a way.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shuhei. Thank you. Olga, your closing thoughts, please.
Obviously, if the audience has not read through this report yet, they should, because it covers the key points of 2025 ethics and compliance programs, and especially the disconnect between leaders and the frontline employees. That's really important to highlight, and especially the transparency that we talked about in this webinar is really important. For example, as a practical example, if the company is collecting data on, for example, misconduct analysis, why do you keep that secret? Just maybe share the analysis with the employees and have a discussion with them, or maybe actually do a training based on those mistrend analysis, prepare a case based on those misconduct. Of course, anonymize, make it more mild so that the actual case is not specified, but still you can use it as a training as well. So using data effectively and actually communicating that data to the employee will, I guess, also be important in closing that gap. And you may be surprised, but sometimes when we do investigations that actually involves a company wide investigation, a lot of the I guess companies try to close that investigation results to the leadership member only. So just discuss the outcome with the leadership. But sometimes it might be effective to involve employees, saying that we trust you. We share this information with you under confidentiality. So let's just have a discussion based on what we found. So even in investigations, if the leadership comes forward and tries to communicate with the employees and have a real discussion, it might roll out actually really differently.
I couldn't agree more. And I've seen a real disconnect in organizations. Some will not do that, some will do it. But what a powerful message. Imagine you're just joining an organization as a young graduate, and you see that anonymized message from senior management. Look what happened. It's such a powerful message, isn't it? Great stuff. Thank you, Olga. Ty, I'm going to leave you with the closing thoughts and the final words of wisdom.
Well, I'll try and be succinct. So, look, two things I'll reinforce, and I've said this at the start of the report, the webinar. It's data. It's using data analytics. A lot of compliance programs and managers and companies are, talking about lack of resources. And I understand that there's cost cutting everywhere, but, using data analytics can really help kind of streamline some of those efficiencies. The report, we looked at high impact programs. They continue to outpace medium impact programs because they leverage advanced tools, analytics, benchmarking, and in the Japanese kind of reports, kind of statistics, nearly 2.6 times more effective than medium impact programs, and they're twice as likely to navigate those complexities and of new regulations and help with risk mitigation. And the second thing is, the lagging adoption of emerging risk efforts. We saw in the global program that medium risk impact programs are trailing behind these high impact programs in areas like third-party due diligence, supply chain compliance, supply chain training, and AI adoption, where rates globally were about 2.3 times lower. But in the Japanese kind of data, we were, 3 times lower. So really, Japanese companies are looking at a small proportion of those high impact programs leading the pack. But I think the answer to solve all of these resource issues and all these adoption issues are taking the data you have and creating effective dashboards to not just look at one set of data in isolation, but looking at comparative data across the organization. So, cross-referencing culture data, understanding where employees are happy, where there's psychological safety, where there's not, where there's speak-up issues, where there aren't, looking at code of conduct data, especially if you've got, a web-enabled code of conduct. Where are employees looking? Where are they not looking? Where are they focused on? Looking at the training data, look at where companies are struggling to help, employees understand the complexities of their roles, which questions in their training they're not getting right, who's taking a long time completing the training. So when you take all that data and compare it all, you can start to see what trends are emerging. And you can start to focus your efforts in regions and divisions rather than trying to blanket cure a whole organization. So using the data you have and using an advanced analytical tool is really crucial to help you manage your resources, predict risk, and really make your program more efficient and effective.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well summarized, Ty. Look, I think we're out of time. But panel, it's been an absolute pleasure. On behalf of the ICA and LRN, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to all of the audience as well. And enjoy reading the report, and we look forward to more insights from LRN, Ty, as well. So a really great discussion. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.